It started like any other move, a family packing up their old life into boxes, saying goodbye to familiar streets, and driving toward a place they hoped would finally be home. The Petersons had been searching for the perfect neighborhood for months, and when they found Lakewood Grove, it seemed like a dream. Wide streets lined with oak trees, manicured lawns that looked like they belonged in a magazine, children riding bikes freely, and friendly smiles from neighbors who waved as they passed. It was everything they had wanted. The house itself was perfect too. 2 stories, white siding with dark shutters, a big porch where Emily Peterson imagined herself sipping coffee in the morning while watching her kids play. Her husband, David, was thrilled about the spacious garage, and their 2 kids, Lily and Max, immediately claimed their rooms with excitement. The real estate agent had said the neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association, but at the time, they thought nothing of it. After all, most nice neighborhoods had one, right? It wasn't until they pulled into the driveway on their very first day that the whispers began, faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakably words carried from one yard to another. Neighbors, murmuring about them, not in a hostile way exactly, but with a peculiar tone as if curious or perhaps even fearful. Emily brushed it off, unloading boxes while David set up the moving truck ramp, but she couldn't help noticing how many eyes were watching them from behind curtains and slightly opened blinds. By evening, they had met a few of the neighbors face to face. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street who baked them cookies, the Harpers next door who offered help unloading furniture, but even in their kindness, there was something guarded, like their smiles never reached their eyes. Then, just as the sun dipped, below the treetops, a man appeared at the end of their driveway. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit despite the casual suburban setting, and he walked with a slow, measured confidence that made the world around him seem to pause. His hair was dark, neatly combed, and his face carried an unsettlingly smooth complexion, almost too perfect, like a portrait retouched beyond reality. When he smiled, there was something about it that made Emily's stomach twist. It was polite, welcoming even, but cold in a way that she couldn't quite explain, as if the warmth was only skin deep. "Welcome to Lakewood Grove," he said in a voice calm and velvety. "I'm Mr. Grant, president of the Homeowners Association. I like to personally greet all our new residents." David extended his hand with a smile, grateful for the gesture, but Emily noticed how Mr. Grant's eyes didn't leave hers, studying her intently, as though he were memorizing something. "We're glad to be here," David said, shaking his hand firmly. "It's a beautiful neighborhood." Mr. Grant nodded, his gaze briefly sweeping over the children, who suddenly grew quiet under his attention. "We have rules here," he said softly, almost like a warning, "but they are simple. Follow them, and you'll find this place is paradise. Break them, and you'll find life here difficult." His smile returned, wider now, but Emily felt a chill travel down her spine. Before she could respond, he tipped his head slightly, as if dismissing himself, and walked away, disappearing down the street with that same eerie confidence. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The new house creaked with unfamiliar sounds. The wind rustled the trees outside, and every so often she thought she heard footsteps on the porch, though when she checked, there was no one there. Around midnight, she wandered downstairs for a glass of water, and that's when she noticed something taped to the front door, a single sheet of paper with the HOA rules neatly typed. She skimmed through them, expecting the usual things about lawn maintenance and noise restrictions, but these were stranger. Rule 1. Lights must remain on outside every night until dawn. Rule 2. No resident may leave the neighborhood after 10 p.m. Rule 3. Mirrors must not be displayed facing windows. Rule 4. When the president visits, you must answer the door. Rule 5. Under no circumstances are photographs of the president to be taken. She frowned, unsettled, wondering if this was some kind of joke, but when David read them in the morning, he only chuckled. "Weird rules, sure, but maybe it's just their way of keeping things orderly," he said. Emily wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, life settled into routine. The kids started exploring the neighborhood, riding bikes with other children, and David returned to work, leaving Emily to unpack and organize. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her, and more than once she caught neighbors staring before quickly looking away. At the community park, she noticed a group of residents gathered around Mr. Grant, hanging on his every word like devoted followers. He laughed with them, his voice smooth and commanding, but what struck her most was that he looked exactly as he had in the old black and white photo she'd seen in the welcome packet, dated 30 years ago. Same dark hair, same flawless skin, same unsettling smile. When she asked Mrs. Jenkins about it later, the older woman grew pale and changed the subject immediately, insisting Emily try another cookie instead. A week later, it happened. Emily forgot to turn on the porch light before bed, a minor slip she didn't even think about until she woke at 3 a.m. to a strange noise, a scratching at the door like long nails dragging across the wood. Heart pounding, she crept downstairs and peered through the peephole, but there was nothing. She flicked on the porch light, and the sound stopped instantly. The next morning, taped neatly to the door, was a violation notice signed by Mr. Grant himself. Rule broken. Do not repeat, it read. No fine, no further explanation, just those words, stark and cold. David brushed it off again, but Emily couldn't. Something was wrong here, something much deeper than strict neighborhood regulations. From then on, she watched Mr. Grant closely. He always appeared at the same time, walking the streets at dusk, greeting residents, observing as though patrolling his domain. The more she saw him, the more convinced she became that he wasn't aging. His face never changed, not even a hint of stubble by evening, not a wrinkle when he smiled, not the faintest sign of fatigue. And the neighbors, oh, how they obeyed him. When he waved, they waved back eagerly. When he spoke, they leaned in with desperate attentiveness. There was fear behind their devotion. Emily could see it in their eyes. One evening, she gathered the courage to ask David if he noticed it too. "He looks young, sure," David said with a shrug. "Maybe good genetics. Don't overthink it." But Emily could see the unease in her husband's expression, a flicker of doubt he quickly buried. Then came the night they broke another rule, and the real horror began. It didn't take long for Emily to realize that the rules, taped to their door, weren't just suggestions or quirky guidelines meant to keep the neighborhood tidy. They were enforced with a precision and authority that felt less like an association and more like a dictatorship. Every morning, as she walked out to grab the newspaper or water the flowers, she would see the same things scattered across the doorsteps of other houses. Thin white envelopes, neatly folded notices bearing the same elegant, slanted handwriting of Mr. Grant. No one complained, no one tore them up in frustration, no one even seemed irritated. Instead, neighbors would quickly gather them, tuck them away like private letters, and then go about correcting whatever had been addressed without a word. One morning, she watched from the porch as the Harper family rushed to repaint their shutters before noon, because a notice had been pinned to their mailbox. Another night, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Grant himself strolling down the street after dark, stopping at homes silently, taping papers to doors under the moonlight like a grim reaper delivering warnings. What disturbed her most wasn't his actions. It was how every resident reacted the following day. No questions, no resistance, just obedience. It was as though the entire neighborhood had been conditioned into compliance, and the air carried the quiet weight of fear disguised as civility. The Petersons did their best to blend in. David made sure the lawn was perfectly mowed. The kids were told to keep their voices down after sunset, and Emily herself double-checked the porch lights every night, as though their lives depended on it. But no matter how careful she was, there was always this gnawing feeling in her chest that something far more sinister lurked behind these rules. She began noticing small details, the way people froze whenever Mr. Grant walked by, the hushed whispers that cut off instantly if he turned his head, the way children never played outside past dusk, as if every parent feared what might happen if they disobeyed. And then there were the photographs. It was on a rainy afternoon when Emily stumbled across the first one, She had been unpacking boxes in the attic, searching for some old picture frames, when she found a dusty stack of newsletters tucked away in a corner of the house. They appeared to be HOA bulletins, dated decades ago, printed in fading ink with smiling photos of neighborhood events, picnics, charity fundraisers, holiday celebrations. She flipped through them absent-mindedly until her eyes froze on a familiar face. Mr. Grant, standing front and center in a group photo, his hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate, smiling that same unsettling smile. The problem was the date at the bottom of the newsletter, 1974. Emily blinked, staring at the page, then at the photo again. It wasn't a look-alike. It wasn't a relative. It was him, exactly as he appeared now. Same flawless skin, same piercing eyes. Not a wrinkle, not a single change in nearly 50 years. Her hands trembled as she flipped through more pages, finding him again and again in photographs from the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, always the same man, always unchanged. When she showed David that evening, he frowned, shifting uncomfortably as he studied the pages. Maybe it's his father or grandfather. Some families look a lot alike, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emily shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No, look at his eyes. They're the same. Exactly the same. This isn't resemblance, David. It's him. David closed the newsletters quickly and shoved them back into the box, muttering something about stress and imagination. But Emily could see the way his jaw tightened, the way he avoided looking her in the eye. Deep down, he knew it too. The more she noticed, the worse it became. That weekend, they attended the neighborhood's monthly gathering at the community center. It was supposed to be a cheerful event, with tables of food and games for the children, but Emily felt as though she had walked into a church service devoted to a single man. Mr. Grant stood at the front, speaking in his calm, velvety tone, and every resident hung on his words like disciples listening to scripture. When he laughed, the room filled with nervous chuckles. When he paused, silence blanketed the space, and Emily saw it then. The way no one ever seemed to meet his gaze for long. How shoulders stiffened whenever he approached. How everyone seemed to simultaneously adore and fear him. She kept her distance, but at one point his eyes found hers across the room, and the faintest smile curved his lips. It was like being pinned to the wall without a touch, her chest tightening, her breath catching, as though he had wordlessly reminded her, "I see you." After that night, the violation notices grew closer to home. One appeared on their door when Lily left her bike leaning against the fence instead of putting it away. Another came when Max laughed too loudly outside after dark. Each one was brief, cold, and signed with the same elegant signature, Mr. Grant. And each one carried the same unspoken threat, comply or face consequences. What terrified Emily most wasn't just the notices themselves, but how quickly her family began to obey. David grew quiet, his cheerful defiance dimming with every warning. The kids learned not to argue, their laughter fading into whispers, and Emily found herself double and triple checking every detail of their lives, terrified of making the smallest mistake. One evening, unable to take the mounting pressure any longer, she confronted Mrs. Jenkins across the street. "How long has he been president?" Emily asked casually, though her voice shook. The older woman froze, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a dish towel. "As long as I can remember," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "And as long as my mother remembered too." Emily blinked in disbelief. "That's not possible." But Mrs. Jenkins cut her off sharply. Don't ask questions. Just follow the rules, dear, for your children's sake." And then she shut the door, leaving Emily standing in the cold night air with her heart racing. Later that week, she overheard something chilling. Walking past the Harper's house on her way back from the park, she caught the sound of hushed voices through the open window. "We can't let them slip up again," Mr. Harper whispered urgently. "You know what happens," his wife's voice replied, trembling. "They're new. They don't understand yet. Please, just give them more time." Emily froze in place, her skin prickling, before hurrying away, her pulse thundering in her ears. They weren't talking about the rules keeping peace. They were talking about punishment. It all came to a head one stormy night when a scream tore through the neighborhood. Rain hammered the roofs, thunder rattled the windows, and Emily bolted upright in bed, heart racing. She rushed to the window and saw a commotion down the street. Neighbors standing on porches, staring as two men dragged the Wilson family's teenage son into the back of a black SUV. His mother sobbed uncontrollably, but no one intervened. No one spoke, and standing at the edge of the street, umbrella in hand, was Mr. Grant, his face calm, his smile faint, as though watching order be restored. By morning, the Wilsons' house was empty, every belonging cleared, as if the family had never existed at all. When Emily asked around, neighbors shrugged and claimed the Wilsons had moved suddenly. But their fear-soaked eyes told the truth. That night, she and David sat in the living room in silence. The rain tapped against the windows, the violation notice from earlier still pinned to their fridge like a warning bell. Finally, David spoke, his voice hollow. "We can't fight him, whatever he is. We can't fight him." Emily stared at him, her hands trembling. "Then what do we do?" David's eyes were haunted when he answered. "We survive. We follow the rules, until we can find a way out." But deep inside, Emily knew escape wasn't that simple. Because no one left Lakewood Grove. Not really. It was bound to happen eventually, not because they were careless or rebellious, but because no family could live under the weight of such rules forever without slipping. And when the Petersons did, it seemed so small, so insignificant at the time that Emily almost laughed at herself for the dread she felt creeping into her chest. But the laughter never came, and instead she carried the heavy realization that this neighborhood punished disobedience in ways that no normal community ever should. The mistake was nothing more than Max, their golden retriever, barking after dark. He had always been a lively dog, protective of the children, and that night, when a raccoon skittered across the yard, he had erupted in a frenzy of barking, his deep growls echoing into the still air of Lakewood Grove. Emily rushed to quiet him, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and when she glanced across the street, she saw shadows move behind curtains, neighbors peering out with wide, fearful eyes, as if waiting for what would happen next. She felt the eyes of the whole street pressing in on her house, their silence louder than the barking had been. David tried to calm her, brushing it off as nothing serious, but Emily couldn't shake the unease. She left the porch light burning, bright, double-checked the locks, and crawled into bed beside him with her heart pounding, listening to the quiet house around them. That's when she heard it, sometime after midnight, a sound that twisted her stomach and sent her heart racing. It was Max, whining, not the playful whimper he made when begging for food, but a low, terrified cry that rose into a sharp yelp. And then, silence. Emily shot upright, calling his name, but the house was too quiet, the night outside unnervingly still. She rushed to the back door, fumbling with the lock, but when she opened it, the yard was empty. Max's chain lay slack against the porch, the collar still attached, but he was gone, as if ripped from it by invisible hands. She screamed his name into the night, but the only response was the distant rustle of leaves and the oppressive darkness that seemed to lean closer with every second. David came rushing down, grabbing her shoulders, whispering for her to calm, down before the neighbors saw, but Emily shoved him away, tears streaming down her face. "They took him," she whispered hoarsely. "You know they did." David's face was pale, his jaw tight, but he said nothing, only led her back inside, bolting the doors behind them. They sat together in silence until dawn, the porch light flickering, the house filled with a suffocating dread. When morning came, Emily opened the front door to find it waiting for them. Another notice, taped neatly to the wood like a cruel calling card. She tore it down with shaking hands and read the words aloud. "Rule broken. Noise after curfew. This is your first warning." There was no fine, no explanation, only that same cold handwriting, and at the bottom, the sharp, elegant signature of Mr. Grant. David tried to take the paper from her, but she clutched it to her chest like proof of a crime, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Max is gone because of this." The children noticed quickly, of course. Lily cried when she saw the empty backyard, and Max asked over and over where their dog had gone. Emily couldn't bear to tell them the truth, so she lied, saying Max had run off during the night and would come back soon, but the look in David's eyes told her he didn't believe it, not for a second. They both knew Max hadn't run anywhere. He had been taken, stolen away as punishment, erased just like the Wilsons down the street, just like every family who slipped too far. And as the day went on, Emily noticed how the neighbors looked at her differently, some with pity, some with quiet warning, but none with surprise. It was as if they had been waiting for it to happen. That evening she saw him again. Mr. Grant, walking slowly down the street, his dark suit pressed, his hair gleaming under the streetlights, his expression calm and unreadable. When he passed their house, he stopped, glancing up at the porch where Emily stood clutching the railing, their eyes locked, and he gave her that same unsettling smile, the kind that felt like it stripped her bare. He tipped his head slightly, as though acknowledging her loss, and then moved on without a word, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Emily felt the blood drain from her face, because in that moment she knew he was reminding her that Max was gone not because of bad luck or fate, but because he willed it so. The house felt emptier without the dog. Nights were heavier. Silence, pressing down on every corner, and Emily began to notice things she hadn't before. The way the shadows seemed to linger longer at the edges of the yard, the faint whispers carried on the wind, the sense of being watched every time she stepped outside. She grew paranoid, checking the locks again and again, pacing the house after dark, clutching the violation notice like a talisman and a curse. David tried to reassure her, but he was unraveling too, his hands trembling as he poured coffee in the mornings, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The children stopped playing outside altogether, their laughter silenced by fear. One night, unable to bear the tension any longer, Emily crept outside and walked the block. The air was cool, the moon hidden behind clouds, and every porch light glowed like a beacon, casting eerie pools of yellow across perfectly trimmed lawns. As she walked, she saw them, other notices, taped neatly to doors, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Some families had several stacked, old ones left untouched beneath the new, like layers of warnings unheeded. She realized then that they weren't alone. Others had broken rules too. Others had been punished. But no one spoke of it, no one rebelled, because the cost of defiance was too high. When she returned home, she found David waiting for her on the porch, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't do that again!" he hissed, glancing nervously at the street. "He'll see you! He sees everything!" Emily wanted to argue, wanted to scream, but instead she nodded, her throat too tight to speak. And in the silence that followed, she understood something she hadn't before. Mr. Grant didn't just enforce the rules, he owned them. He owned the silence, the fear, the obedience. He owned the entire neighborhood. Days bled into nights, and the Petersons lived in constant dread, waiting for the next mistake, the next punishment. Every sound made Emily flinch, every shadow made her heart race. And though she never spoke it aloud, she couldn't shake the feeling that Max's disappearance was only the beginning, the first warning in a series of punishments designed to break them down until they were like the others, silent, obedient, hollow. She didn't know what would happen if they slipped again, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, it would be worse. Much worse. The next few days felt like a slow suffocation, as if the air inside the Peterson house had thickened into something heavy and poisonous, pressing on their lungs until every breath felt shallow. Emily moved like a ghost, drifting from room to room, staring out windows for any glimpse of their missing dog, though deep down she knew she would never see Max again. The children whispered about him at night, Lily clinging to her stuffed rabbit, asking when Max would come back, and Emily forced a smile she didn't feel, promising soon while her stomach twisted with guilt. David grew distant, working longer hours, staying out late under the pretense of catching up on deadlines. But Emily knew it wasn't just work. He was avoiding the house, avoiding her, avoiding the truth that had settled over their lives like a storm cloud that would never break. What haunted her most wasn't just the loss of their dog, but the way the neighborhood behaved as if nothing had happened. Families waved politely, children played in silence, neighbors carried groceries to their doors, all with the eerie calm of people who had accepted the unacceptable. They were all complicit, all trapped, all terrified, and yet none dared to speak a word against the man who ruled them. One evening, while the kids worked on homework at the kitchen table, Emily sat alone in the living room, staring at the violation notice still taped to the fridge. She had tried to throw it away, but every time she reached for it, her hand froze, trembling, as though touching it would invite something worse. So she left it there, a constant reminder of their fragility, of how little it took to bring the president's wrath down upon them. The sound of footsteps on the porch jolted her out of her trance, and she hurried to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. Mr. Grant stood at the bottom of the steps, hands folded behind his back, his posture perfect, his face serene. He wasn't holding a notice this time. He wasn't delivering punishment. He was simply standing there, staring at the house as though waiting for it to bow to him. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, and she ducked behind the curtain, pressing her back against the wall, her breath ragged. Minutes passed, maybe longer, until finally the sound of his footsteps retreated down the street. When she dared to look again, he was gone, but the message was clear. He didn't need paper to remind them who was in control. The next morning, a new rumor floated through the neighborhood. Emily overheard it at the park, whispered between two mothers as they pushed their toddlers on the swings. "The Petersons lost their dog," one said softly, her voice trembling. "First warning," the other replied, her eyes darting nervously around. "They'll learn now." When Emily stepped closer, the women quickly changed the subject, forcing tight smiles, but the damage was done. Everyone knew, everyone was watching, and everyone expected them to fall in line. David noticed the shift too. That night as they sat in bed with the lights off, he turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "We can't let this happen again. No more mistakes, Emily." "Not one. Do you understand?" She nodded silently, tears burning her eyes, but inside she felt something else brewing. Something dangerous, because the more she thought about Max, about the Wilson boy dragged away in the storm, about the decades-old photographs where Mr. Grant never aged a day, the more she realized that survival wasn't enough. Survival meant submission, silence, obedience, and eventually becoming one of them, hollow, fearful, complicit. And Emily wasn't sure she could live like that, not without losing herself completely. 2 weeks passed without incident. The Petersons were meticulous, hyper-vigilant, following every rule as if their lives depended on it. The porch lights stayed on from dusk till dawn, mirrors were covered, the children were in bed before 10, and the house was kept spotless. But the fear never left. It lingered in every corner. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the porch light bulb. Emily began to notice changes in her children too. Lily stopped drawing animals, her pictures now filled with houses and fences, rigid lines that looked more like cages than homes. Max grew quieter, his once boisterous laughter replaced by nervous glances toward the windows whenever the sun began to set. It broke her heart, watching them wither under the weight of rules they barely understood, robbed of the carefree childhood they deserved. Then came the night she saw something she wasn't meant to see. She had woken restless, padding to the kitchen for water, when headlights swept across the living room curtains. Curious, she peeked outside and saw a black SUV idling at the end of the street. 2 men in dark suits stood by the vehicle, speaking in low tones, and then from the shadows, Mr. Grant emerged. He walked with the same measured grace, his hands clasped behind his back, his face illuminated briefly by the glow of a streetlight. Emily's breath caught in her throat, because for the first time she saw his eyes clearly, and what stared back was not human. They were too bright, too sharp, reflecting light like glass, and for a fleeting second, she swore they glowed faintly as if lit from within. The men opened the SUV door for him, bowing slightly as though he were royalty, and then the car drove off into the night. Emily stumbled back from the window, her heart racing. Whatever Mr. Grant was, he wasn't just a man clinging to power. He was something else entirely. The next day, she confronted David, desperate to make him see. She told him everything she had witnessed. The glowing eyes, the men bowing, the car that vanished into the night. But instead of agreeing, he snapped, his voice sharp with fear. "Do you want them to hear you? Do you want the kids taken next?" "Stop, Emily! Just stop!" His anger wasn't at her. Not really. It was at the hopelessness, the terror, the suffocating realization that they were powerless. But his words cut deep, leaving her alone with the knowledge that she couldn't confide in him anymore. If she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself, and so she began to watch, carefully, discreetly, from the safety of shadows. She noted the times he walked the streets, the houses he visited, the way neighbors reacted to him. She learned that violation notices weren't the only punishments. Sometimes families simply disappeared without explanation, their homes sold within weeks to new, unsuspecting residents. Other times, small transgressions led to sudden illnesses, strange accidents, or pets vanishing in the night. The pattern was always the same: disobedience, then silence. And through it all, Mr. Grant remained unchanged, untouched, ageless. One evening, as she sorted through the old newsletters again, Emily made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. At the back of one issue was a photograph of the original HOA board members, dated nearly 50 years earlier. There were 6 of them, all smiling, all looking proud. But as she traced her finger over their faces, she realized with horror that every member except Mr. Grant had changed over the decades, replaced by new names, new faces. Only he remained, always president, always at the center. And worse, the other board members seemed to vanish from the newsletters entirely after only a few years, as if erased from history. She wondered if they had disappeared like the Wilsons, like Max, swallowed by the same darkness that hung over the neighborhood. Her obsession grew, consuming her every waking thought. She began keeping a journal, scribbling notes about every strange occurrence, every odd detail, every whisper she overheard. She hid it under the mattress, terrified of what would happen if it were found, but unable to stop herself. David noticed, of course, and begged her to let it go. But Emily couldn't. She needed to understand what they were up against, needed to know why Mr. Grant never aged, why he held such power, why the neighborhood obeyed him like a god. And most of all, she needed to know how to escape. But escape was not so simple. One night, when David suggested they take a trip out of town for the weekend, just to breathe, to feel normal again, they discovered the truth. As they drove toward the exit gates of Lakewood Grove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, the gate never growing closer, no matter how long they drove. Panic set in as David pressed the accelerator harder, sweat beading on his forehead. But the gate remained distant, as though the neighborhood itself were a loop, trapping them within invisible walls. Finally, after what felt like hours, they pulled into a cul-de-sac they swore they had passed before, the same houses staring back at them like mocking faces. Exhausted and shaken, they returned home, and when Emily opened the front door, a new notice was waiting on the mat. Rule broken. Attempted exit after curfew. Second warning. She collapsed against the doorframe, the paper trembling in her hands, while David stared in stunned silence. There would be no leaving Lakewood Grove, not unless Mr. Grant allowed it. That night, as she lay awake listening to the silence, Emily realized something terrifying. The first warning had taken their dog. The second had trapped them in an endless loop, punishing even the thought of escape. And if there was a third, she didn't want to imagine what would be left for him to take. Emily had been restless for nights, her mind unable to settle after the second warning, and every creak of the house felt like an omen of something worse to come. But it wasn't until she overheard a hushed conversation between 2 neighbors at the mailbox that the idea of sneaking into an HOA meeting rooted itself in her head. Because the women, their voices shaky, spoke of a gathering that would happen on Friday night at the clubhouse. Not the usual friendly potluck or boring budget review, but something they dared not describe, only crossing themselves as if to ward off evil. And Emily knew then that if they wanted the truth, if they wanted to understand what bound them here and why the president never aged, they would have to see it with their own eyes. David thought she was insane when she told him, whispering in their bedroom, with the kids asleep, his face pale with fear, saying it was suicide, that if they were caught, it wouldn't just be another notice but something final, irreversible. Yet Emily's determination burned hotter than his fear. Because she could no longer live with half-truths and whispers, she needed proof, something that explained why their lives had been hijacked by a man who smiled like a mask. They argued in the dark, voices tight with desperation, until finally David gave in, not because he believed it was smart, but because he saw that no amount of begging would dissuade her, and deep down he was just as haunted, just as desperate for answers. Friday came like a tightening noose, the hours dragging, the air charged with a strange electricity that prickled their skin. And as the sky bled into twilight, Emily and David tucked the children into bed early, pretending everything was fine, though Max, their son, gave them a long suspicious look as if sensing their deceit. They waited until the house was silent, until even the cicadas outside had quieted, and then crept out the back door, sticking to the shadows, their hearts pounding in rhythm with every step. The clubhouse stood at the far end of the neighborhood, an elegant building with tall windows and manicured hedges, usually hosting summer barbecues or holiday parties, but tonight its windows glowed with an eerie golden light, flickering as though from candles, and faint murmurs carried on the breeze, rhythmic and low, like the hum of bees inside a hive. They crouched behind the hedges, peering through a crack in the curtains, and what they saw froze them in place. Inside, the long conference table had been pushed aside, replaced by a circle of chairs filled with neighbors they recognized, smiling parents, retirees, young couples, all sitting rigid, their eyes fixed on the center of the room where Mr. Grant stood, immaculate in his pressed suit, his hands clasped behind his back, that same unsettling smile painted on his lips. Around him, candles flickered in a perfect ring, their flames swaying though there was no breeze, and etched into the floor in what looked like chalk, or perhaps something darker, was a symbol, intricate and spiraling, impossible to look at for long without feeling dizzy. Mr. Grant raised his arms slowly, and the murmurs from the neighbors rose into a chant, words that made no sense, guttural and ancient, vibrating with power that Emily felt in her bones. David grabbed her wrist, his grip tight, whispering for them to leave, but Emily couldn't move. Her eyes locked on the scene as Mr. Grant closed his eyes, his body illuminated by the glow of the candles. Then it began. Wisps of light, faint at first, like smoke rising from the chests of the seated neighbors, lifting from their bodies as though siphoned by invisible threads, drifting toward Mr. Grant, their faces contorted, jaws tightening, eyes glazing over as though something vital was being pulled from within, and yet they didn't resist, didn't scream, only sat obediently as if this agony were routine. The wisps of light gathered around Mr. Grant, swirling into him, sinking into his skin, and his face seemed to shimmer, the faint lines around his eyes smoothing, his cheeks growing fuller, his posture straighter. He was absorbing them, feeding on them, drinking their life energy like a man parched with thirst. And Emily realized with dawning horror that this was the truth behind his eternal youth. He wasn't ageless by luck or genetics or wealth. He was stealing the vitality of everyone who lived here, keeping himself young while they withered, bound by rules that kept them compliant and fearful. David pulled harder, dragging her back behind the hedge, his face ashen, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "We have to go now, before someone sees us." But Emily's mind raced too fast to obey, fragments of realization colliding. This was why the rules existed. Not as arbitrary control, but as rituals, ways to keep the neighborhood in line, to ensure the meetings were never disrupted, to provide him with a steady stream of energy, harvested in secret while the rest of the world saw only a well-kept community. And if this was true, then their punishments weren't random either. The missing boy, their vanished dog, the looping roads that trapped them, all of it was part of his control, his feeding, his cult. Emily's stomach turned, bile rising in her throat, but David's urgent tug finally broke her trance, and together they stumbled back into the shadows, hearts racing, terrified of being spotted. They crept home in silence, every rustle of leaves sounding like footsteps, every flicker of light a potential pursuer, until at last they slipped through their back door, bolting it shut behind them, their breaths ragged and shallow. Emily pressed her back against the door, trembling, whispering, "It's a cult. It's not an HOA, it's a cult." And David, pale and shaking, nodded grimly, saying, "And we're trapped in it." They collapsed into bed, too shaken to sleep, their minds replaying the horrific ritual over and over, the neighbors chanting, the light draining from their bodies, the way Mr. Grant glowed with stolen vitality. It was burned into their vision, impossible to forget. And yet, as the night stretched on, another thought crept into Emily's mind, more chilling than the ritual itself. If he was feeding on them, if he needed them to sustain his unnatural youth, then leaving was never an option. They weren't residents. They were livestock. The next morning the neighborhood looked the same as always, as if nothing had happened. Children rode bikes, sprinklers sprayed neat arcs over perfect lawns, and neighbors waved politely, their smiles a little too stiff, their eyes a little too hollow. But Emily couldn't unsee what she had witnessed, couldn't stop herself from scanning each face, wondering how much life had been drained from them, how many more rituals they had endured. At the playground she saw Mrs. Carter, who used to be vibrant and lively, now moving slower, her skin pale, her once shiny hair dulled. She caught sight of Mr. Lewis trimming his hedges, his hands trembling as though weighed down by years he hadn't yet lived. They were being harvested piece by piece, sacrificed in exchange for Mr. Grant's eternal youth, and no one dared speak of it. David refused to discuss it in daylight, terrified of hidden ears, but Emily couldn't hold it in. That evening, after the kids were asleep, she pressed him, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here. He's feeding on them, David, on us. You saw it." David raked his hands through his hair, pacing the room, his face drawn. "What do you want me to say? That we pack up and leave? We tried that, remember? The road doesn't let us, and if we break another rule, if we get another warning, Emily, we won't survive it." His voice cracked, raw with fear, and Emily's resolve faltered, but only for a moment, because even if escape was impossible, even if rebellion was suicide, the thought of living as nothing more than fuel for that monster was unbearable. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Emily made a silent vow. She would keep watching, keep gathering information, keep finding cracks in his armor, because if there was a way to break the cycle, a way to destroy the ritual, she would find it. For her children, for David, for every hollow-eyed neighbor trapped in Lakewood Grove. The secret meeting had shown her the truth, but it had also lit a spark inside her, a dangerous, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, Mr. Grant wasn't invincible. The night they decided to make their move was thick with silence, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing down on their chests as though the neighborhood itself were listening, waiting and judging. But Emily knew they couldn't wait any longer, not after what they had witnessed in the clubhouse, not after realizing they were nothing more than cattle being bled slowly for the president's youth, and so she packed quietly in the shadows, stuffing essentials into bags while David checked the car one last time, moving with the tense urgency of a man who no longer believed in miracles but was willing to gamble anyway. The children sensed something was wrong, their wide eyes following every hushed whisper, and when Max asked if they were running away, Emily didn't lie. She only placed a trembling finger to her lips and whispered, "We're leaving, sweetheart, but you can't make a sound, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly, more mature in that moment than he had any right to be, while Lily clutched her stuffed rabbit like it was a lifeline, her small hands shaking but determined not to cry. The family slipped out through the back door, locking it behind them as though it mattered, as though the walls of their prison could protect them once more, and crept toward the car parked in the driveway. The streets were too quiet, unnaturally still, the lamps casting pale yellow pools of light on perfect lawns and trimmed hedges, but no curtain stirred, no cars passed, no voices carried through the air, and Emily realized with a shiver that the neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see if they would try. David slid into the driver's seat, the keys rattling faintly as he started the engine, and the sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. Emily swore she saw a curtain twitch in the house across the street, a pale face retreating into darkness, but no alarm was raised. No one stepped outside. They drove slowly at first, then faster, the engine humming as the familiar streets passed in a blur, and for a moment Emily dared to hope, dared to believe the ritual hadn't made them untouchable, that maybe, just maybe, they could outpace whatever curse held this place together. The gate came into view, tall and wrought iron, flanked by brick pillars with decorative lanterns glowing warmly as if welcoming them out. David pressed harder on the gas, his knuckles white against the wheel, and Emily gripped the armrest so tightly her nails dug into the leather. The children held their breath in the back seat, eyes wide as the looming gate grew closer and closer still. But then, without warning, the lanterns flickered once, twice, and went dark. The iron bars shuddered, groaning as though stirred by some unseen force, and with a slow, grinding finality, the gate swung shut before them, locking together with a metallic clang that echoed through the night like the toll of a bell. David slammed the brakes, the tires screeching, the car skidding to a halt just feet from the barrier, and for a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. The only sound their ragged breathing, and the soft ticking of the cooling engine. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, her stomach dropping as dread settled in, because she knew it wasn't just coincidence, it wasn't a mechanical failure. The neighborhood itself had closed the way out, sealing them inside like prey caught in a trap. David cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the steering wheel, his eyes wild. But before he could throw the car into reverse, a figure stepped out from the shadows by the gate, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. Mr. Grant, immaculate as ever, not a hair out of place, his suit crisp, his smile serene. He moved with the same measured calm, hands clasped behind his back, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and the children whimpered softly in the back seat, instinctively shrinking away from the figure who seemed more spectre than man. He stopped a few feet from the car, tilting his head as though studying them, and when he spoke, his voice was smooth, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of inevitability, of authority that could not be denied. "Leaving so soon? I had hoped you were settling in, but I see old habits die hard." His eyes gleamed faintly in the moonlight, reflecting like glass, and Emily felt a cold shiver run through her bones, remembering the way they had glowed in the clubhouse during the ritual. David's hands trembled on the wheel, his jaw clenched tight, but Emily reached out and touched his arm, silently urging him not to do anything reckless. Mr. Grant took a slow step forward, his smile never faltering, his tone almost conversational. "You see, Lakewood Grove is not a place one simply leaves. It is a sanctuary, a community, a covenant. Those who live here are bound by rules, for their own good, and in return they are granted peace, safety, and order. But when those rules are broken, when faith falters—" His smile widened, though his eyes remained cold. "There must be consequences." Emily wanted to scream, to demand why he had taken Max the dog, why he drained the neighbors, why he played God with their lives, but her voice caught in her throat, strangled by fear. David, however, found his voice, though it trembled. "We don't want this. We don't want you. We're not staying in your cult." His words cracked at the edges, but the defiance in them was real, burning like a fragile flame in the suffocating dark. Mr. Grant chuckled softly, shaking his head as though amused by a child's tantrum. "Cult. Such an ugly word. No, Mr. Peterson, what you have seen is not a cult. It is survival. You see, time is a merciless thief, and yet here, within these gates, we have found a way to keep it at bay. Order, obedience, sacrifice. These are the cornerstones of our little haven. Without them, all would crumble, and chaos would swallow us whole. I ask only for loyalty, for adherence, for respect of the covenant that sustains us. Is that so much?" His words were calm, reasonable even, but Emily saw the shadow beneath them, the predator masked as a benefactor, and her fear twisted into something else, anger. "You're killing them!" she hissed suddenly, her voice breaking, but strong enough to cut through the night. "Draining them, stealing their lives just to keep yourself young. You're a parasite." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and David's hand tightened on hers, as if bracing for the blow that would follow. Mr. Grant's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened, a flicker of something ancient and monstrous flashing across his face. He stepped closer, the air around him heavy, suffocating, and leaned slightly toward her window. "You call it theft. I call it balance. They give, I receive, and in return, they live here in peace, untouched by the outside world's decay. It is a fair trade, Mrs. Peterson. You misunderstand your place in it." He straightened, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, and his voice dropped, colder now, stripped of pretense. "You stand at a crossroads. Obey, and you may live out your days here in comfort, your children safe, your lives orderly. Resist, and you will vanish, as others have. The choice is yours, though the outcome is already written." He gestured toward the gate, which loomed tall and unyielding, its iron bars glistening in the moonlight like the teeth of a cage. There is no escape from Lakewood Grove. There never was. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by Lily's soft sobs in the back seat, muffled by the rabbit she clutched to her chest. David's chest rose and fell rapidly, sweat beading on his forehead, his mind racing between fight and surrender while Emily stared at Mr. Grant, fury and terror warring inside her. For the first time, she understood the true cruelty of the neighborhood, not the rules, not the punishments, not even the rituals, but the illusion of choice. He wanted them to believe they had a say, when in truth the cage had already closed around them the moment they moved in.